Hey everyone, I am here with Daniel Gertz, who is one half of Hansi Freinecht. He is a writer who writes about metamodernism, and he also has his own press and website called Metamoderna. Daniel, how are you?
I'm surprisingly well,
Good.
despite.
Good to hear. So I just want to start off. Tell me a little bit about how you came upon the term metamodernism and I guess why you decided to start developing ideas under this banner.
Yep, yep. So initially, if you're a sociologist like me, you go to university and you come across different thinkers in the humanities and the social sciences, and there's a certain spirit you're brought up into. You're brought up to be critical. You're brought up to be, in a sense, a contrarian, in a sense, a punk for the rest of your life. You're always, no, screw the system, and this isn't good enough. We can see power structures here, or unfounded assumptions or prejudices there, or we can find capitalism sneaking in and taking over everything, or the quantification of everything under the banner of neoliberalism, for instance. So you have all of these critical perspectives, and they sort of naturally gravitate to the political left, but they don't have to live there, or they can be more apolitical as well. And all the time you're looking at how everything is constructed. You're sort of deconstructing it. So you look at a movie, for instance, and you stop and think like, what makes this movie an exciting movie? What underlying gender relations do we see play out in this movie as silent assumptions that cannot be questioned or that are pressed upon the viewers, for instance? And I went pretty deep into that, of course. I mean, you're studying, you're feeling into it, you invest in many of the ideas and many of the critiques, and you also do get a sense of moral outrage, in a sense, that, wait a minute, there were a lot of red pills to take, a lot of things to wake up from, to become a little bit more conscious or woke about. There are a lot of things that aren't exactly as they should, that we have every reason to question. There are a lot of techniques in turn, or a lot of methods to unearth those questions. You want to look at unequal power structures, for instance. Statistics tends to be pretty good. You look at how much money do men control versus women, and a very stark image that wasn't exactly apparent in every everyday interaction just comes to the fore, and you can start reflecting on that, and that can have an depressing effect on you, but also an emancipatory effect. Now, if we go to term all of the things I just said, what's the red thread of this being critical, questioning, deconstructing, highlighting power structures, unearthing injustice, shedding light on the contradictions of everyday life, of democracy, of capitalism, and so forth? Well, in a sense, all of these things try to comment upon modern society. So it's something that tries to go beyond modern society and critique it and say, wait a minute, modern society, you said we're all equal under democracy, but we're not all equal. This doesn't add up. And the farther modern society and modernity progresses, the more you have of this critique, interestingly enough. So it becomes more and more popular, and more, not just university professors who are sort of a priesthood in this thing, but just normal people, and of course more and more students from various backgrounds start to think about these things: post-colonial heritage, environmentalism, gender issues, and so forth. But what's the term for all of these things put together? Well, that could be postmodernism. There are different takes on this term, postmodernism, and I have For my part, I use the term postmodernism self-consciously sloppily, because I think it's a much more useful term if you use it widely and sloppily, because it then highlights a bigger phenomenon. And
yeah, if you try to use the term precisely, I mean, it's a term that's almost designed to resist any kind of precise definition.
pretty much. But if you use that wider term, so if you would have asked all my colleagues and professors and so forth that had a sociology department, and you ask them, what do you think about postmodernism? Most of them would have said, well, it's not for me, it's too relativist or whatever. But if you use this wider term of postmodernism, this sentiment of critique, let's say, and this critique of modernity and of modern society, of mainstream society in many ways, then it was built into the walls. There was no place outside beyond postmodernism. So, and there were examples for this. So eventually, when you started having,
well, if I may, why do you think that is? Why do you think that the academy simply just stops at postmodernism? I guess one of the questions I was actually going to wait until later to ask is, how has the academy reacted to your ideas? But why don't you see, like, it seems like the people in that are trying to become meta-modern theorists are all these outcasts, you know?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
So this goes into a deeper and more complex issue, namely how do psychologies develop, personalities develop, and how do political ideas or sensibilities develop, or even theories about society? How do these come about? Now, so we are all social beings, and knowledge is the most social thing we can do in the world. We have to learn from one another. We have to verify or peer review one another. So it's for there to be knowledge, there has to be a social process that produces and legitimizes the knowledge, that communicates it, and so forth. Now, so if you think about that, let's say a certain type of knowledge will assume 1,000 different factual assumptions about everyday life and reality. So let's say the modern mainstream. Let's say you never went to university, you never heard the word structural power imbalance or gender relations or post-colonialism, right? You never heard any of those words, or racialized, or class structure. So who are you then? Well, usually you're part of mainstream society, and you assume certain other things that you were taught in grade school. You live in a certain three-dimensional Newtonian space. You believe that if you work hard, you can get what you want on the market in terms of producing what others want, and there's a free exchange there, and that if I specialize on my thing, you specialize on your thing, and we help each other through goods and services that we provide to one another, then something comes along. So there's a process of growth, or growth of GDP, economic growth, but a process of something more profound, progress, right? That modern society progresses, and it doesn't always turn out well, but on the whole, it makes people richer, and it liberates us, right? Those are the ideas of modern society, that something along the lines of capitalism, but you can also have versions of socialism, etc., work together with some sort of democratic processes, work together with the processes of science, and with the freedom of the individual, with liberalism. Then these things working together create some sort of mainstream life that is really worth living. Now, there are a lot of assumptions we just made there, and they all reference one another. So they're a sort of cluster. They're a cluster of many memes or ideas or assumptions about reality and ourselves and identities, of course, and ways of being and habits and so forth, modes of consumption. All of those things taken together reinforce one another. So to escape that sort of modern, I've just described the modern world. To escape that modern world, you can't just, well, I'll question a little here on democracy. I'll question a little here on gender imbalances. I'll question a little here on whether or not the market is actually rational. I'll question whether the way we produce science is actually useful and universal. No, to get out of that whole ecosystem of ideas, the whole galaxy of ideas that have a sort of gravitational pull on each other, if you want, you have to change many different assumptions across the board. You have to challenge all of those different things, which is usually why, to become truly postmodern in your mind, you often need maybe a bachelor in the humanities, or at least be influenced by some sort of culture where there are many bachelors in the humanities, and university professors and whatnot, and people, anarchists who have whole bookshelves of resistance. And eventually, you have a whole new world of as many assumptions, although it'll be more critical assumptions, but you will have assumptions of the postmodern kind, which reinforce one another. So if structural inequality is a sort of a red thread, you'll see, there are structural inequalities across race, gender, other 4 types of ethnicity, class, function. There are even species, of course, or it's one of the biggest one, in fact. And you'll see that, yes, there is something powerful about the engines of capitalism, particularly today's global capitalism, but at the same time, these very same engines, because they are powerful, also strengthen exploitation. And you will see that there is that the modern project, to begin with, produces both alienation, loneliness, deteriorating togetherness and mental health and a sense of meaning, and of course ecological disaster and extreme inequalities on a global scale, and at the same time it greenwashes or whitewashes everything to hide those very things, because that wouldn't sell as well. and it makes us also all into marketers who are, semi-psychopaths, and we're all fucking miserable. But those are a lot of different assumptions. So with that comes a whole aesthetic, right? So if you go into a postmodern home, I swear you will find Frida Kahlo on the wall somewhere, or on a necklace, or or you go in a vegan restaurant. There will be people with non-typical gender identities, because, well, they're resisting one part, and that makes the other parts of the resistance more intuitive to them. And so eventually all of these different assumptions strengthen one another. So each of these major jumps in, let's say, a developmental stage of thinking, well, they're difficult to wriggle out of, right? They have an incredible gravitational pull. So if you're part of the modern world, let's say mentally speaking and personality-wise, going to a postmodern sensibility means you have to challenge things across the board. You have to tear down structures even within yourself. You have to change so many assumptions about the world. Now, if you want to go beyond the postmodern, which is what we're talking about here, this same thing applies. The postmodern sensibility is going to defend itself, because you speak to a postmodern person and they have, or a person with a postmodernist sensibility, they're going to have all of these different assumptions. Knowledge is constructed, and development is often a fraud, or is often a trick being pulled on us by some claim to power that is disguising itself, and so forth. So when they hear somebody coming up with hopeful ideas of a sort of new type of progress, or challenging the idea of skepticism, they just hear the modern mainstream talking, and they feel a little bit smug, and they're like, I think you might have a few more things to learn. And of course, within that setting, there's a competition about who can be most critically critical to bust the other critics. So they're going to compete to become the most critical one. And then they're going to be, in that setting, everybody's going to be on high alert for anything to pick apart or critique, or to mark the words. And what do you mean when you said we all? Who's your we?
Yeah.
And that sort of pulls you back. Like there's a gravitational pull. Once you come to postmodernism, then postmodernism has its own gravitational pull. So if you put together hundreds of postmodernist people in the same building, guess if the gravitational pull is going to be strong, right? So it's hard to get out of, and that's why you only have renegade scholars. But I want to land one more point, Jared, before.
Well, oh sure, please.
Yeah. And it's that if you are then skeptical of the postmodern skepticism itself, this is a point out by me, by Jason Storm, another theorist, then you see that, my skepticism, or the postmodern skepticism, is skeptical of everything, but not of skepticism itself. If you follow it to its end point, and you're skeptical even of skepticism itself, you realize that skepticism itself has its blind spots. And there's a source then of hope, or a sense of progress, or constructed sense of progress. That's sort of an enlightened madness moving forward. And that's sort of the fountainhead of metamodern sensibilities and metamodern projects and ways of relating.
Yeah. You brought up something in your latest book that I found to be particularly eloquent that kind of speaks to, I think, what you're talking about. And you say that, or you and Emil say, Hansi says that there's something uniquely appealing about being relentlessly critical and stopping there, because criticizing the world and kind of coming up with all these different reasons why the world is bad allows you to basically not take on any responsibility, because changing the world is impossible. So you can really be noble and have, no responsibility on your shoulders at the same time. It's almost like a nice little politics hack that's just too appealing for people to say no to.
Well, yeah.
The second thing I wanted to say is, you mentioned movies and how people will say, oh, well, let's look at this movie through a gender lens or through a racial lens and something like that. And, a lot of times, I've dealt with a lot of people suggesting readings like that of movies, none of which are necessarily not valid, but there is something about this postmodern position that is relentlessly joyless. And, I was really kind of just pulled into philosophy entirely due to me being a big film fan. And I found that I would be in that situation a lot where I would say, yes, you can look at Shrek through the lens of gender theory and like politics. I know, and this is actually a conversation that I once really had. But one, you can say that about pretty much any movie ever. We can, really look at the things that are unique about Shrek and kind of analyze those. But also there is this sense that there is virtue in destroying, that just, it takes, and I think the thing that kind of pushed me away from a lot of these postmodern sensibilities was there's this notion that joy is useless, that we can just do without it, that really just criticizing society and expecting it to be better, that should be enough joy for you. And all of like the silly joys that you get from Hollywood movies or video games or whatever that have all these, hidden problematic elements, you are allowing these problems to continue if you don't bring it up, and kind of rob it of all of its joyful content. And I don't think that that's a very tenable position to kind of really build a movement on, because I think that nobody can really function entirely without joy. But anyway, I wanted to take this as an opportunity to then bridge to the second topic, which is Jordan Peterson, who you chose to be kind of not really the subject of response in your newest book. And he definitely, makes a lot of claims about the problems of the postmodern perspective in his work. How would you account for Peterson's rise in popularity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is a very important question. I think Peterson speaks to the very blind spots of postmodern sensibilities. So exactly the things you mentioned, the joylessness of postmodern sensibility, but also the lack of responsibility in a sense. Are you going to be the punk for the rest of your life, and then you're going to become a university professor, which is another of humanities, which is another way, many ways of saying a member of the postmodern priesthood, the priesthood that purifies or is a moral sort of moral corrective or conscience of some otherworldly conscience of the modern capitalist world, sort of like for a feudal system or medieval world. You had the priest, and they talked about saints, and they talked about sainthood and the purity of your soul and virtues and so forth, and piety. But at the end of the day, they couldn't actually reform the world. They could change some of its structures, but the wars were ongoing. Slavery popped up again and again, and so forth. And at the same time, in the same way, you sort of have today's priesthood, and it's the intellectuals, it's the writers, it's the critical journalists, it's the artists. The priesthood analogy becomes almost literal, because the artist is not partaking in the process of change itself. But then we go to a museum, we'll look at something, and then we critique it. This is very good environmentalist art. This is very good post-colonial art, we will say. And then we sort of feel purified, and then we go back to our hipster lives, right? And people sense this. There's more than a modicum of hypocrisy going on here, and they sense that, wait a minute, these moral projects are corrupted by the social games of everyday life, by one-upmanship, where issues of busting one another morally or using deconstruction of another's just way of thinking or way of showing up in the world to insult them, or to put them down and put yourself above them, or to just basically in self-serving social games. And people are busted by all of those self-serving social games, and again. So you're trying to express yourself, and then somebody comes and busts you with a feminist argument, and now you're the black sheep, and like everybody else is a good feminist all of a sudden, but you're a freaking creep, and you should have known XYZ, but maybe next time, right? And people have these experiences all the time, and it legitimately leaves moral outrage in us. And the more immature the group, with the more immature power games going on, let's say college kids, the more they will use all of these, what I call purification or inquisition technologies that they learn, social technologies, for such purposes. And that's, of course, what happened to Jordan Peterson, and he got really pissed. He got in all these fights with all these college kids, right? And he really got the whole inquisition going after him, and then he went like, no, and started defending himself. And in that, because he was articulate and so forth, he articulated what a lot of people felt, white men in particular, of course, but other groups as well. So that's, I think, that together with, of course, just rhetorical and just emotional intensity. This phenomenon, right? So it's a response fundamentally to postmodern pathologies, you might say, or postmodern side effects that we didn't account for when we invented all of these things as humanity. Yeah.
And what do you think? We talked a little bit about this very briefly before we started recording, but how do you think about the way that he is received? That it's very polar opposite. It seems like, I mean, in my videos, for some people, I get the feeling that anything less than seething hatred is seen as complicity, and people just have no space for you, and you're written off as demonic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, so for me, I think it's well. First of all, I mean, I am more on the critical side than on the admiring side. But I mean, many of my close friends are on the admiring side. So, but I think basically he went in and became a sort of personification of the cultural wars. So, and the cultural wars then are in postmodernism, as I described it, will have unintended side effects. The biggest major unintended side effect are the culture wars, because, well, people start using all of these social technologies for fighting what they perceive to be social injustices, which are truly there. I have to underscore that a million times. But then there are groups who unduly somehow become vilified or excluded or attacked, and they get righteously angry, and they're the, let's say, Trump supporters, etc. And what then was meant to be an emancipatory and inclusive and diversity enhancing and perspective taking enhancing project, underlined with sociology and so forth, were under just powered by all of the things that we have in the social sciences. Instead became this divisive and toxic field that further and further pulls these polarities apart. Now, then, if a person shows up and becomes the leader of the resistance to the resistance, so the leader of the reaction, one side will see a Jesus figure. We have been oppressed, almost suffocated by postmodern sensibilities and social justice and so forth for a couple of decades now, and we couldn't speak up, because if we tried, we were penalized. We were penalized out of our jobs. We were penalized out of our relationships. We were shamed. We were guilted. And somebody comes up and has the power and wherewithal to articulate the resistance to the resistance. You feel you have a liberator. You have a new hero. Now, that sort of admiration from what the others already see as the dominant group and the powerful group makes them very suspicious, and partly rightly so, because what is the reaction to the resistance? Well, other examples include reactionary movements like Nazism, reactionary movements like the KKK, the Contras in South America, and so forth. So people are on the progressive side, let's say, are naturally suspicious of reactionaries. So they see demonic powers, like really, like you've dug underneath Moria and now the Balrog's coming up. If then one person at the same time gets that much attention, that in itself is a self-reinforcer. So because the person gets so much attention and such intense attention, that means that people will, regardless of the person himself, what he even may be saying or not saying, that person will will that will personify this struggle. So every other person hears him speak. He said it's saying, "Oh, we're going to come back to reason. Things are going to be normal again. You're not going to be there's not going to be a huge witch hunt going after you because you're a white male or whatever." The other side are hearing him saying, "You're going back to the kitchen, bitch. You're going
Right.
You're a slut. You slept with too many guys, and you're a Negro. You should go back, right, and work in the fields, right?" That's what the other side are hearing him saying. He's not actually capable of either thing because he's just a guy, but that's what people feel are at stake, right? So if they hear support for him or resistance to him, they feel such deeply personal things are at stake, right?
Yeah, the term I hear get thrown around a lot is dog whistle, where basically if somebody that you don't like says something, I mean, and dog whistles do exist. I don't want to think that I'm skeptical of all times that this term is invoked, but sometimes it feels like if somebody you don't like says something that, you know, isn't crazy or that you might agree with, then, you know, we kind of frame it as a dog whistle for a much more nefarious perspective because anything that this person says must be discredited. But, you know, I would ultimately put myself also in the more critical position. But, and I think maybe you would agree with me on this, or I'm just assuming based on your work, is that sometimes he has helped people that I know, you know, that he's helped. And I'm very grateful that an influence like him was there to at least help these individuals. That's not to say that perhaps his influence hasn't also hurt other people. I don't think there's really anyone who's a solely benevolent force that only helps and there's no bad externalities to their celebrity or their influence. But I want to focus now on one of those. I know that he's been kind of a catalyst for a lot of people turning back or turning to God for the first time. And one of the things that he recognizes is that there's kind of a crisis of meaning in our generation. People who, you know, myself, I grew up during the Bush administration, during kind of, you know, when I was in high school, the kind of the Jordan Petersons of our time were Richard Dawkins. You know, he was the new atheist movement was a breath of fresh air when every day we would turn on the news and we would see George W. Bush invoking God to justify, you know, these really bad foreign policy blunders. And so, you know, with Jon Stewart on the TV, we were all very snarky and felt justified in our departure from any kind of faith. And then I think recently there's been some consequences to that. And I think that Peterson is one of the few voices out there that speaks to it. And so my question is, well, so give me an idea just briefly about kind of what you think Peterson's prescription to fight nihilism is and how your work differs from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, well, first I have to say, I'm not the person best qualified in the world to summarize Peterson here, but roughly I would say like this. So you have before modernity. Modernity starts 500 years ago with the Renaissance, in a sense, in the arts first, and then it goes through the scientific revolution, through the Enlightenment, through the expansion of suffrage and industrialization and capitalism in the 1800s, up until the liberal state, the liberal democratic state with women's suffrage in the beginning of the 1900s, up until maybe some few decades ago, where the majority of the population in those countries that had achieved liberal democracy were actually modern people, in the sense that they were secularized to the degree that they view universality as genuinely something you have to achieve through intersubjective communication, verification, falsification. You can't read it in one book. There's no one source of universality that comes from private revelation. It has to work through what Ken Wilber called public revelation. I really like that term, right? So you go from private revelation to public revelation. That was a long journey for humanity to take. Historically speaking, maybe not so long. Modernity came pretty fast in a sense. But it's the same impulse. You can recognize it, right? And when modernity really grows into its later stages, you have postmodernity and postmodernism, like the stuff we talked about, this critique. So, which is a further secularization, if you want, right? That in modern life, you're still a believer in a sense, and oh, I am an individual. You don't say a soul, you say an individual. I'm part of a community, etc. But it's not. Those things are further questioned, right? Now, there is something that, I mean, we're not built for all that level of abstraction or secularity or secularism, right? We're built to have fairly close to home ideas about a spirited world, and so forth. So we're suffering for it, and there is a profound suffering, and we're feeling really lost. So when Peterson, he says, okay, I'm gonna. He notices all of this, and he says, I'm going to save God, because if you look at the old religions, and if you peel off, and it's particularly in Christianity, particularly of the Protestant kind, if you peel off the layers of, like, well, you know, Jesus walking on water, or things like that. And then there is an existential truth that was there all along, that all the waves of secularization, all the new atheists never managed to throw out. It's like, okay, if you forgive another person, the issue no longer has a grip on your heart, so you are now free. So a person being really good at forgiving the whole world is a pretty saintly person, and just really almost literally saintly. And there is something genuinely, and you can, in deep religious experience, if you really give your heart away, you can experience those things, and that is a real thing. That's not woo-woo. It is true. It's rare. It's difficult to achieve, but it's true. And belief structures in God, or in miracles, or in forgiveness, or in deep personal responsibility will make it more likely that you achieve those states of the mind. So whether or not these things are factually true, and whether or not they're misused by whatever church or cult or whatever, those things are true nonetheless. And you can see, if you have those goggles on, you can see that present in that presence within religious artwork. There's just no way humanity could have created such sublime artwork. And let's see, Jared. Look, I have to break in. Are you getting noise in the background now? Because they're
no, I'm not hearing anything.
The alarm here for the because it's the first Monday of the month, so but it's going to be over in a minute. So anyway, if you check into those deeper layers, what you get is that there is a truth that goes beyond rationality, and that trans-rational truth is present in the artworks and in the inventions of symbols that we have, symbolic figures such as the saints, their auras, the angels, the devils, and so forth, that are non-arbitrary. And what a person such as Peterson laments is that we have become entirely disconnected from those non-arbitrary insights that are actually the deepest source of meaning and beauty in our civilization. So I think that's a very, very, very real concern. and it's a thing I'm sympathetic towards. Now, where I feel it gets problematic, or where I would take another path, is that when you then scratch the surface, what again and again, Jordan Peterson is in different interviews where he will be pushed on the issue on his faith, and he will reconstruct the faiths in a postmodern manner, or deconstruct the faith in a postmodern manner, and sort of dodge the question: what is faith, what is belief, and so forth, what is God. But at the end of the day, if you keep pushing him, he will say, and he will quiver with his voice, and that I'm this close to actually just believing it, to just literally believing in the word of the Bible. I'm this close to just giving my rational mind away to this doctrine of faith. Now, a very serious thinker like this guy, I don't think he actually does it at the end of the day, right? So he sort of oscillates and returns back. Now, but that stance or the position for most minds will create an attractor point where you will collapse your mind to believing absolute bollocks about reality. And that absolute bollocks will open your mind wide open. Like there's basically opening the window and the doors to somebody saying, hey, I'm actually closer to this source of truth than you are. I'm your priest, I'm your guru, I have heard the words of the prophet, I have interpreted texts, I'm a theological authority, so now I'm going to tell you what to do, and I'm going to fuck your wife. And it always happens, or molest your kids. And it always happens again and again, or I'm going to tell you to go to war, or I'm going to tell you to not take a certain medication, or I'm going to tell you just give me my money, give me your money, because hey, what are your money worth in your little life compared to the ultimate truth that we have right over here? And it's this close, but I'm a little closer to it than you are. Now, how do we end up there? What did we give up? Well, the victory of modernity was the victory of intersubjective verification. Now, when intersubjective verification didn't work well enough, we had to intersubjectively even verify the context within which we can make intersubjective verification. That's postmodernism. Well, don't give that up. You will end up in awful cultish power structures, and you will be controlled by demagogues. And you will believe crazy stuff about causalities that don't exist. Now, incidentally, despite all of his qualities, I believe that Jordan Peterson himself has become such a demagogue, a sort of a prophet for the disgruntled. And I think reason is going out the window. And I think it is entirely unreasonable that so many people spend, how many hours of footage is there of this man online? And I've met so many men who have watched every minute more than once. Like we are getting into crazy land here. I mean, and this movement, of course, is not unique in the world about going into crazy land. The internet is crazy land these days, right? And it has all of the paraphernalia, let's say, of schizophrenia. People start talking about UFOs, like my schizophrenic uncle. People start talking about pedophiles and Q and QAnon and Nazis and all these things intermission. They're reptiles and the Earth is flat. And fascism is blooming again in new LSD-laced manners. So it's I mean, this thing is not alone in being crazy land on the internet, but like, can we please keep our sanity and get God back?
Yeah. So
yeah.
Well, before you get into sincere irony, which I think is where you were about to go, there's two questions I want to ask you just about kind of Peterson's prescription for this problem, which I think you put pretty well. Um, I guess my first question is just personally, would you ever recommend religion to a friend that you knew was struggling? Because I have in my life, even though I'm probably much more aligned with what you propose in your book than I am with going back to religion. But, you know, not everything works for everybody. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah. So as you know, if you read my stuff, you know I'm a huge fan of the tradition in psychology that's called adult development psychology. And adult development psychology postulates and finds empirically again and again in different ways that personalities follow these sort of attractor point structures, like I described earlier about modernity having so many things that reinforce one another. Then you have to break up the whole structure to recreate a new, let's say, postmodern structure, and then we hold each other into those full, or we hold each other in place into those structures. And the same thing sort of works with the mind or the personality at large for adult people. And what adult development psychologists of different kinds and brands have found, roughly speaking, is that you have a sort of pre-conventional mind, more corresponding to adolescence in most of us, where, I mean, you can be a kind person, but it's just on a fundamental level, you're a little bit more egocentric, and you just have difficulties really living up to the norms of the society you're part of. And if you don't get past that egocentrism, your antisocial tendencies in adulthood tend to lead to stuff like criminality or delinquency of different kinds, right? And after that, you have a sort of a stage which more corresponds to traditional societies, where you really identify with the role. I am a doctor, and then you have certain clear rules or you know, positions or stances or values or virtues that you're like, okay, this is how to be a doctor. And you like to read really literally, like, first do no harm. Okay, let's not over medicate people or whatever. And then from there on, you can move into later stages of development, where you first maybe, okay, I don't just want to be a doctor, I want to be a really good doctor. How can I optimize or achieve this? And then you get into critical stages, post-conventional stages of development. Like, maybe, wait a minute, maybe psychiatry doesn't even work for sociological issues. Maybe we're over medicalizing. Maybe we have more and more resources in the psychiatric system, but we have less and less mental stability in the population. How does this? And then you start going outside of the box, let's say, and from there on you have the postmodern and the metamodern sort of sensibilities that can manifest in your personality. Now, religions, the traditional religions, they emerged at a certain point in history called the Axial Age, 2,500 years ago, roughly, which is really interesting. It emerged across the board in different civilizations, roughly at the same time. And very similar ideas, right? People don't know about Orphism, for instance, but Orphism is the mystery school of the ancient Greeks, had a lot in common with or what was really a precursor of Plato's thinking, and had an influence on the Pythagoreans and so forth. And Orphism literally got the same structure up as of reincarnation, as Buddhism did, for instance. And Socrates, in his his long speech when he gets executed, he literally lands in the Christian doctrine of heaven and hell and the soul and the eternal soul and so forth. So these things across the board, non-arbitrarily, started popping up in a certain kind of society, a certain stage of development. And likewise, there's a certain stage of development in the mind where that is the solution, let's say. So there's no coincidence that people go to jail because they robbed somebody and they might have killed somebody. And what do they meet there? Well, they might meet a priest. They might come across a 12-step program.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
yeah,
Alcoholics Anonymous.
Exactly right. So they usually become born again Christians or Muslims. And in those cases, religion really saves their souls and creates a structure of stability within which they can productively live out the rest of their lives, right? Now, you have similar ideas, you have similar cases on the other side of the spectrum, highly, highly progressive and open-minded and pro-social people, but who get in too deep with the complexity, who get in too deep with the existential issues of our time. And then their minds sort of eventually just fold over under the pressure and they regress and they forget about all that progressive stuff and they become by the book Muslims or Islamists even, right? Or born again Christians. That happens a lot too. You will see a lot of progressive theologians go through those movements. But maybe that was an optimization for their personality. But because the psychological prerequisites of higher complexity, of wider perspectives get higher and higher, increase. There's
so
more.
So like you're saying, it's I guess for you, maybe prescribing religion is a short-term strategy that you would be open to depending on the developmental stage of a particular individual. Does that sound right?
Well, yeah, I mean, religion in that sense. I mean, as you know, if I'm more supportive of William James's definition of religion. So religion, religio, that which connects all, that which connects everything. So I believe that human beings are inherently religious beings. That we can call ourselves non-religious all we want because we want to distance ourselves from a certain doctrine, but we are religious through and through, and everything we do is we build little religions, faith structures, because hey, at the end of the day, you can't prove most things. And you're going to have heuristics and so forth, and you're going to have fictional ideas about your whole little hero story and about the world out there, which is just incomprehensibly large and complex. So at the end of the day, we are all religious, and we can construct different religions. And I think the meta-modern perspective is the meta-modern perspective then appreciates and loves all of the different stages of development and tries to coordinate them in a case-sensitive manner. So the huge difference between somebody like Sam Harris and me is that Sam Harris believes the world, if people just stopped doing the immature shit of religion, the world would be a better place. I think if people just stop doing that, and you don't have the psychological prerequisites for further development already in place and tested and tried over generations, the world would literally collapse. Because I think these are real and non-arbitrarily created scaffolds, and that they also, to a certain extent, include real knowledge or real insights. Or at least partial insights that would be lost without the religious traditions.
Right. So, okay, let's talk about sincere irony then. And in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of throw out a definition, and then you can give me kind of a yay or nay, because then I kind of want to talk further about the details there.
Okay, yeah, we have 39 minutes left. Yeah.
Yeah. So sincere irony is an attempt.
Are we okay with this stuff, or should I?
Yeah, yeah. If you want to just maybe just pull down the shade, or even if you just no, that sounds good.
Yeah. In the interest of time, right?
Yeah.
And otherwise, I'd like to hear a little more. I get curious about other things about your life in Finland and so forth. But maybe we should talk some later time. Right?
Okay, we'll see. I think we might be able to pack it all in.
Yeah.
Okay, so sincere irony is an attempt to again to both take to be relentlessly skeptical and kind of divorce yourself from the kind of magical claims of religion to basically have a orientation of irony towards the core beliefs of it so that you can have enough distance so that you can inhabit other perspectives. And at the end of the day, as you say, you're not going to go to war for a religion because at the end of the day, you're away. You have enough of a distance from it to where it can't, take advantage of you. At the same time, though, you are kind of making yourself intentionally gullible so that you can experience the magic of the world, that you can still kind of glean the existential truth claims that are kind of hidden in these stories while not actually believing that the stories actually happened. Does that sound about right?
Well, yeah, it does, and I also want to emphasize, right, whether or not you believe in the or how much weight you want to put in on the two hemispheres of the brain hypothesis, that certainly these are modes of operation, and we tend to get stuck in one mode or another. So if you go to my new ageyist friends, and some of them are, I'll be frank, some of them are fairly dumb, and but you put one of those simple brain scanners on them when they meditate on something, and you see their brain will just drop like this, and then they start thinking about a date they had, and they get sexually excited. The brains just go off the charts, and then they come back down. I mean, people can have such intensity and such aliveness, and you can even see it on a brain scanner, right? And whereas if you go to one of my thinkier friends, where maybe he has ADHD, you see nothing of the sort, but they won't believe the dumbest thing they hear, or the last thing they hear every time. When they will think for themselves, and they will have multiple layers of self-reflection and self-correction for everything they do, etc. And I understand that these two things can coexist. First of all, the first thing I mentioned, being intensely in the now, being in tune with the subtle qualities of relationships, of interplays of the environment around us, of our own emotions, and so forth. That is what makes life worth living. It really is. That's where we are happy, and this is proven with research, like really large-scale research. The more you daydream, less happy you are. The moments when you daydream, even about a good thing, even about a thing you have positive expectations about, and so forth, then you're even with that, you're less happy than if you're just being in the flow in the moment, right? On the other hand, if we don't think, if we don't if we don't actually check and double check and triple check things, well, we are open to being fooled, to suggestion, to following demagogues and leaders, to be manipulated, basically, and also to do evil things. Unfortunately, cults do evil things, and cults optimize for the first part, not the second, and they will have clear doctrines. Again, they will say thinking is evil, you should be in the now, right? Which incidentally makes you very easy to control, right? And let somebody else do the thinking for you. Now, we get stuck on one side or the other, and we really need to cultivate both in the same people, but also across the population. And we need to oscillate more easily and quickly between both of these sides. So we need to develop farther and farther in both directions, and we need to become that. At first, we can only oscillate with a great difficulty. So you're stuck over here, and you go over here, and then you're stuck there, and then for a long time, eventually you get used, etc. And then you're like, wait a minute, there's some thought in the back of my head, and then you're here being in the doubter again. But eventually, if you oscillate faster and faster, I mean, you work at transforming your mind between different states, or transform, or the relationships you're in, or the complementary skills and capacities that we have as human beings. Then eventually, I believe, at least, there's an attractor point that's a sort of superposition of both, which you might call the philosophical mind. The philosophical mind is when there's both intellectual depth and management of complexity, and there is a sense of spiritual depth. And so spiritual only people, they tend to be able to produce poetry and religious doctrines and so forth, or prophecies, or astrological projections and whatnot, but they don't produce they don't produce philosophical insight. At the same time, you have on the other side scientists who produce all sorts of mental models, and find new empirical truths and solutions, and engineering and so on, and manipulations of reality, or third-person reality of objects out there. But all that stuff empties us out and makes life less worth living. But they also don't produce philosophical insight. So philosophical insight sort of comes when we successfully strand these two things. And philosophical insight then is the most transformative, I would say. It's where, well, there's a sort of, it's in the junction between science and religion, in a sense. So I believe that superposition of these two things would be a metamodern religion or spirituality, and I believe that's where we sort of need to. That's the sort of thing we need to create rituals around, and practices, and doctrines, and theologies, and science, of course, and philosophies, to be able to achieve at a collective level.
Yeah, there's something about this that I feel like recently I've been reading some stuff where I can see some other thinkers, some of them have been dead very long time, who I almost want to say maybe are thinking something very similar, but just putting it in different words. For example, have you heard of the book there's this, I think he was a French sociologist named Paul Veyne, and he wrote a book called Did the Greeks Believe Their Own Myths? Have you heard of this book?
No, I didn't. No.
Okay, so his thesis is basically that there are different modalities of belief that we juggle at the same time. One of them could be like, belief in history, and the other one could be, believing in transcendental kind of metaphysical things, in the interest of sanity or whatever. So, I mean, this definitely came to mind when I was reading your work. But then the other one is, I don't know if you've ever read any Chesterton, but I know that you mentioned in the book that at least you're more of a Zizek fan than a Chomsky fan. And, Zizek has his own, like he calls it Christian atheism, which is kind of building off of the work that Chesterton wrote in Orthodoxy, where Chesterton basically makes the argument that there is an essential alienation from God that is essential for us to feel any kind of existential freedom. And the reason I'm bringing these other two up, because again, I think if you asked Chesterton, hey, there's kind of like a very pragmatic, very utilitarian bent to your faith, he probably maybe would secretly admit to it. But then when it came to, having a dialogue with the other people in his church community, he probably wouldn't admit to that. And I guess my question is, to what extent do you think that, and I know we're only guessing here, but would you guess that Peterson is kind of already on this level, but he knows that, you know, before we were just mentioning that there are, I guess, tens of thousands of men who have watched hundreds of thousands of hours of content twice or whatever of Peterson. If this maybe suggests that, you know, they do need a you know, a figurehead, a prophet, so to say, and it would be probably too charitable of a reading to say that, well, Peterson is, you know, kind of funneling their desire for a prophet toward Christ. I think probably he's kind of owning a little bit too much of it for himself. But I guess my question is, to what extent do you believe that Peterson personally is kind of already on this wavelength, but he just thinks that, again, he's taking the short-term strategy, is not invested at all in developmental levels, just saying, all right, what is the decision, what are the options that we have for the circumstances we have right now? And the answer, the best we got, is religion. Dostoevsky was right. Don't be Raskolnikov.
Yeah, yeah. Difficult to say, but he does speak very productively with John Vervaeke, for instance, which is a friend of mine and thinks very close. I mean, has ideas or philosophies very, very close to metamodernism. Yeah, so that overlap makes me lean into what you're saying and say, well, there's definitely something there. But I like to look at it a little bit more transpersonally. It's like we have different pieces of the puzzle and different garbage we need to get rid of, and there is this sort of attractor point, and we have different qualities. So this sort of intensity that Peterson brings to the table, and a certain piety and compromisingness in his faith, those are the important parts of him for a more, you know, transpersonal or transrational perspective to come to the fore and to take root in our culture, let's say. Do I believe that if you look at his actual belief structure, that it's that the sort of doctrine I'm talking about is there underneath the hood? Nay. And the reason for that is multiple. First of all, he's a guy who speaks his mind, so he would speak his mind, particularly in the theological discussions on these issues. The second one being, well, there are times when he talks about everything from politics to religion, where, well, the things that we have reason to be critical about, that reveal completely other structures of the mind, right? That the classical conservatives, for instance, and you wouldn't, if you really have this insight. I mean, he did a whole political manifesto for classical liberalism, but eventually came out and called it a manifesto for conservatism, right? And
so if I could,
there's something about that, and there's something about when he's pushed on these issues that where he actually surrender. Well, you know, he gets to a point where he's very close to surrendering to just classical evangelical faith, right? And if he were actually under the hood a secret metamodernist in the way I've been describing it, I think that struggle with evangelical faith would already be resolved. That's what I believe. What do you want to say?
Well, I guess I'm just not sure that because there's a debate that he had with Sam Harris in which he, I think, is most stringently pressed on his philosophical beliefs in as much as I have seen. And it's funny that you say that when you press him, he'll ultimately say that, all right, I'm willing to almost give up, you know, all of my rationality to some sort of posture of faith. Whereas in this particular debate, and again, I'm unfortunately, at least for the sake of researching for my video, I am not one of these people who have seen everything that he's done twice. But in this particular video, Sam Harris is basically just begging him to come out and say, hey, Noah's flood probably didn't happen. Jesus probably didn't get resurrected 3 days later. These are not historical truths. And he's not willing to say this. And so for me, it's like, if I were to suggest that maybe he is kind of an under the hood metamodernist, it would be that he's a metamodernist in that his personal thing is that I need to, just to be sane, orient myself to as much mysticism as I can get away with. But at the end of the day, if you put a gun to his head and say, go sacrifice all of your money or all of your family for Christ, he probably wouldn't do it. But again, he knows that in the short term, we're not going to be able to, maybe he doesn't know this, but if he had read your book, he might frame it in this way, that in the short term, we're not going to psychologically develop people sufficiently enough. So for now, I'm going to, just do the good old Platonic noble lie and tell everybody that, Christ is the way, because that's just the best we can do. That would be my formulation of how Peterson is possibly an under the hood metamodern.
No, there's no Platonic lying going on there. Like that. I don't know. Like we all just see surfaces, right? We never know what's underneath, even with people. Of course. So we can't tell, right? But like my sense is this guy is intense. And like in the beginning of that book, what was it? The myths,
12 Rules for Life.
No, meaning Maps of Meaning book, right?
Oh, okay.
Book, he gives a little account of his life, and he says there was a voice, like blah 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 voice, and like shouting in the back of his mind. And eventually that voice starts speaking out loud, right? And we notice that, well, when I do that, I'm aligned. That was my real self. I mean, I have similar experiences, maybe not that literally, but I mean, sure, the whole writing experience and so forth was like somehow another stronger voice that sort of came from deeper inside comes and takes me over. And for some reason, I start writing furiously, even though I always talk fairly mind-bannerly, but when I think it's recognizable that it is like this, that the reason this stuff reaches through so much is that the guy has very close connection then between his whole mind, like access to himself without inhibition, and then that he speaks, right? Not without reflection on how you communicate and so forth. That's part of it, but I believe that what we're getting is what we're seeing, basically, right? I don't think, yeah.
Okay. I do want to so I promised people that are on my Discord server that I'd ask some of the questions they wanted to ask you. But before we do that, and I might do this and sacrifice time for doing it, but metamodernism in movies. So there's two movies I want to ask if you've seen, and maybe you haven't, but have you seen the movie Spring Breakers?
No, I haven't, but I'm gonna watch it as soon right after this. Then,
okay,
yeah.
So this is the only, so for my 2 cents, this is the only metamodern movie that's ever come out. It's a movie that is, because when we talk about, so let me just take that. Have you seen the movie The Matrix Resurrections, the 4th movie?
The 4th movie, the one that was recently released?
Yeah, 2021.
No, 2021. I'm sorry, I didn't. It's like I have a 1-year-old. That's probably why.
No. Well, I mean, you might want to check both of them out, because I think The Matrix Resurrections might have been made with your ideas in mind. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a bad execution of it. Okay. Because, well, I don't want to spoil it, but, well, okay, I'll just give you the basic thing. The first half of the movie is pure slapping you in the face postmodern cynicism, and the second half of the movie is back to sincerity.
Okay.
But Spring Breakers is the only movie I've ever seen where the entire movie is really a wavering between being ironic and sincere. And to me, that's at least a good execution of metamodernism. I don't want to, in art, I don't want to say that it's, that The Matrix Resurrections, for example, wasn't metamodernism, but the entire movie, you can't really put your finger on, is this really a celebration of like the beauty of youth culture, or is this just like a smirky critique of it? And it's funny for reasons that I've never seen anything else be funny before. So I'm just a huge fan of that movie, and your work really animates that movie for me. But anyway, I just got a couple questions.
You have me at hello there. I'm gonna watch this stuff.
Okay, cool. All right, so this is from someone on my Discord. His name, his screen name is ABV. And he says, can you ask Daniel to elaborate on the installation of metamodern value memes in more impoverished countries or in regions undergoing serious conflicts? How long such an installation will take, and is it even possible?
Okay, yeah, so that's really beside a lot of what we've been talking about here.
Yeah, this is just favor to the fans.
Okay, but my background is then, of course, within sociology, and also, I mean, I did economics and political science and so forth, and did write intervention papers for foreign policy in Sweden and so forth. So it is a topic very close to my heart. I also was the future of governance researcher at a thing called One Project for a while. And I believe that metamodernism, for it to emerge, I have actually shifted a little bit my emphasis over time. My initial belief was that places like Sweden and Finland could go ahead and become examples of the world. There will be a documentary coming out with me talking about such issues in Finland. So I think that's something I still believe, but I think it's a smaller part of the picture than I imagined. Given that there are different stages of development, but also that metamodern perspectives include not just linearly climbing sort of development. It's also about what's the triangulating across the potentials of the different kinds of culture and development that exist in the world at one and the same time, right? Sort of like the markets, global markets. Let's say NAFTA will work by having both rich US and not so rich, medium rich Mexico right next to each other, and both parties actually benefit from the difference, or the differential, because you can optimize for labor and so forth across the larger market, right? Or price optimize and so forth. So in that way, without perhaps the capitalist connotation, you can think across the whole scale of development and see that emergence of, let's say, metamodern solutions exist where there are not necessarily where they're most postmodernist, but where there are most fruitful potentials or interactions across the scale. And sometimes that, or very likely, that will be in global South countries, not the usual suspects, then, not New Zealand, Finland, Holland, etc. Right? And an interesting dynamic there is that well, the idea of leapfrogging is very old. That the later a country has entered into industrialization, the more it has been able to leapfrog under the current order of global trade, for instance, that's upheld by the United States and its Navy. So in the digital age, you can actually leapfrog into institutions that are more metamodern, whereas countries such as Sweden or Finland, they have more institutional baggage, let's say, from modernity and post-modernity. Whereas traditionalist or pre-traditionalist even societies need to invent, maybe write a constitution from the scratch. They can have more up-to-date, intelligent, or digital age and deglobalization resistant constitutions written from the get-go, and invest then into distribution structures or governance structures, or then of course production and transport structures and power grid structures that are more in tune with the deglobalizing but also highly digitizing world, right? Or intentionalist economy, etc. So they could have, for instance, a digitized democratic civic culture a little bit more from the get-go, building on particularly indigenous practices. So traditionalist practices can go some way. The most useful ones and the most intuitive to human beings across the board are always the indigenous culture practices. They evolve over 200,000 years, literally, and they're much more closer to how we intuitively work, right? They're the best user X experience in the history of the mind. So, or user X design, I meant to say. So I think we will be seeing metamodernist Renaissance structures in the global South taken off in the next few decades. But let's not be naive about it. It means, I mean, for these structures to work, they have to be designed with real metamodernists working in tandem with local authorities, etc. You must avoid warlords who just want to legitimize themselves by hopping on the last trend. Well, this is the thing. What's Rwanda, for instance? The government of Rwanda are pros at infiltrating progressive circles and showing up, with a post-colonial, let's say, it's just a surface, right? Underneath, this is a terrible regime, right? And right. It's dictatorial in every sense. You don't want to be dictatorial. So you have to find actually legitimate structures. You have to critically vet those by all the normal metrics of human rights and so forth. And you have to be conscious of, well, if you put in metamodern structures in place, that doesn't mean you magically get a population with metamodern sensibilities. Rather, you need structures that are institutions and structures that are in place which meet people coming from completely other sensibilities. But the structures in and of themselves can be metamodern because they're capable then of meeting, of not oppressing, let's say, indigenous impulses, which modern structures do, and then from there on, leapfrogging from the indigenous into the digital age in meaningful manners that are more sustainable and can actually sustain also the shocks of deglobalization. So you don't build the whole economy on, let's say, exporting half of the world's cobalt from your contested southern jungles, right? You need some sort of real alternative to that. So I believe there is a future for that, but I believe that unfortunately where we're at in the discourse of developmental economics and anthropology and sociology and related disciplines and the political correctness around it, etc., I think we're a far cry from that potential, but the potential is there. It is an attractor point, and your questions really, really nails this important point.
Yeah. Okay, well, in the interest of time, I think we're gonna cut it off here. But Daniel, I hope that, and this also extends to Emil when he is in a place that is quieter and he can record. I hope this
Yeah.
is the first of more conversations. But before we go, do you want to just shout out any of your books or maybe your website to anyone who may be listening?
Yeah, well, exactly. Let's do that then. So, if you want the basics of my brand of metamodernism, which does not only analyze culture but looks at how society develops and can develop, it's called the Listening Society. It's called that way because it's about building the welfare of the future, and it's by then Hansi Freinacht. If you want to go deeper in that and think about how to build a meta-modern transnational movement who could actually build listening societies around the world, the follow-up book to that is called Nordic Ideology.
I'll give us some visual aids.
There are visual aids. There you go. The Nordic Ideology has nothing to do with far-right stuff. When we decided the title, we lived in, let's say, happier and more naive days when those things were not up on the carpet, up on the table so much. So, but anyway,
it's funny that you say that. Like when I got my first day at my new job, like I bought this shirt that has like one of the insignias of the Finnish flag on it, just so that my Finnish coworkers would be like, "Hey, this American guy, you know, he's cool. He's here in Finland and he wants to, you know, blend with the Finns." And literally the first day they told me, "Hey, that symbol has been co-opted by the Finnish far right. Probably not a good idea to wear that." I'm like, are you kidding me? So
it is like that. So I mean, yeah, this gets misunderstood even by far right people. Thinks I'm their friend, right? So then there's the new book, which is about being a person in this wider movement of metamodern sensibility and just surviving with your sanity intact. And it's called 12 Commandments. It of course plays on 12 Rules of Life by Jordan Peterson, but let's say it's the progressive or metamodern answer to his 12 Rules for Life.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Daniel. And thanks everyone for listening.